Well, our first guest tonight, attorney Joel Leppert, wants to spare his clients, two young women, the burden of testifying publicly on worldwide television against Matt Gaetz at his Senate Judiciary Committee confirmation hearing. Their testimony is already available to the Senate Judiciary Committee because they testified for several hours to the House Ethics Committee, which has written a full report of their testimony that includes just how much money Matt Gaetz paid them for sex, just how many thousands of dollars he paid each one of them. And that House Ethics Committee report includes eyewitness testimony of Matt Gaetz having sex with a 17-year-old girl in the state of Florida where the age of consent is 18 years old. And when you hear what our first guest has to say tonight, you will understand why I now, as of tonight, firmly believe that Matt Gaetz cannot possibly survive a Senate confirmation hearing. Matt Gaetz will not be confirmed, cannot be confirmed in the United States Senate. Matt Gaetz cannot survive the testimony that already exists against him from the young women he paid to have sex with at parties, and no one can help him now, not even his new cheerleader, Elon Musk. And that's why it's important to know that today, Elon Musk lost again. Elon Musk's dramatic public failures as a lobbyist continue while Donald Trump continues to take Musk with him everywhere he goes, the same way that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt always took his little puppy dog with him everywhere he went. But Elon Musk, like Donald Trump's children before him, is learning the hard way that being at Donald Trump's side doesn't mean he's listening to you. Today's big public loss for Elon Musk was Donald Trump's selection of Howard Lutnick as the next Secretary of Commerce. The loss for Elon Musk in that is that he was publicly lobbying through social media posts in favor of Howard Lutnick getting a different job. He wanted him to get Secretary of the Treasury. But Elon Musk lost. And now his candidate is not going to get Treasury Secretary. Elon Musk will not have the Treasury Secretary that he wanted. Donald Trump hasn't chosen a Treasury Secretary yet. The Treasury Secretary could be hugely important to Elon Musk's fortune in Bitcoin. Elon Musk clearly wants a Treasury Secretary who will do whatever he can to make Bitcoin even more profitable for Elon Musk. And so Elon Musk lobbied Donald Trump, both publicly and privately, urging him to choose Howard Lutnick. And Donald Trump said, no. That is exactly how it's going to work when Elon Musk and his sidekick, Vivek Ramaswamy, who will play Robin to Musk's Batman, advise Donald Trump on what budget items the president should cut. Elon Musk will then discover that the president doesn't have the power to cut the budget. That power belongs exclusively to Congress, and Elon Musk will then have to lobby Congress to cut the budget. Elon Musk has promised to cut $2 trillion from the budget of the United States of America, and I have promised you that that will not happen. In fact, anyone who knows anything about the budget of the United States can promise you that that will not happen. It is highly doubtful that Elon Musk will be able to take credit for any budget cuts in the American government, even though Donald Trump has assigned him the title of a job that does not exist, the director of the Department of Government Efficiency. And as I've reported here before, that job was described by Donald Trump as a purely advisory assignment in a fictional department that does not exist. And so that just makes Elon Musk another Washington lobbyist trying to get the Congress and the president to agree on budget cuts that he suggests. And in one of Musk's big defeats as a public lobbyist this season, one of his first big defeats, Elon Musk saw and felt what the Republicans in the United States Senate think of him after Elon Musk told them, ordered them to elect Florida Senator Rick Scott as the Republican Senate Majority Leader. Rick Scott came in last of three candidates in that election, and Republican senators ignored Elon Musk and voted for the longtime presumed heir apparent of Mitch McConnell, Senator John Thune of South Dakota. And those Republican senators cast those votes for John Thune after Elon Musk publicly said Republican Senator Thune is the top choice of Democrats. And today, lobbyist Elon Musk once again offered his full support for Matt Gaetz for Attorney General of the United States. And now you know that support means nothing in the United States Senate. Matt Gaetz's future is now completely up to Republicans in the United States Senate, who have already shown how willing they are to reject lobbying from Elon Musk, who today said this: "As for these accusations against him, I consider them worth less than nothing under our laws. A man is considered innocent until proven guilty. If A.G. Garland, an unprincipled douchebag, could have secured a conviction against Gaetz, he would have, but he knew he could not. Case closed." The only audience for that tweet is the United States Senate. And that is not the way Republican senators see federal criminal investigations of members of the House of Representatives for possible sex trafficking and possible criminal drug use. In the federal investigation Elon Musk refers to, Matt Gaetz's best friend, Joel Greenberg, pleaded guilty to 6 federal offenses: sex trafficking of a child, illegally producing a false identification document, aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, stalking, and conspiracy. Matt Gaetz's best friend, Joel Greenberg, is now serving a prison sentence of 11 years for those crimes. Not all cases of men paying for sex meet the federal criminal standard of proof for federal sex trafficking charges. And so, if Matt Gaetz escaped those federal charges, that does not mean that he did not, for example, commit statutory rape. In the Ethics Committee evidence in this case, as you will hear in a moment, it is that while he was a member of Congress, Matt Gaetz, in the state of Florida, had sex with a 17-year-old girl. In the state of Florida, the age of consent is 18. And so that incident may not be sex trafficking, but it does fit the age elements of statutory rape in Florida. In the under oath testimony that 2 young women gave to the House Ethics Committee, you will hear that when Matt Gaetz discovered the girl was 17 years old, he patiently stopped having sex with her until she turned 18. Elon Musk was there at the creation of the Gaetz for Attorney General campaign. Reports in the New York Times and elsewhere indicate that a plot was hatched on Donald Trump's plane among the 3 people in Trump world most disconnected from reality: Donald Trump, Elon Musk, and Matt Gaetz. The 3 of them thought Matt Gaetz for Attorney General was a brilliant idea. Reporting indicates the plot was hatched while Donald Trump's next White House chief of staff, the politically professional and astute Susie Wiles, was in another section of the plane. And now the New York Times is reporting that one of the geniuses who came up with the Gaetz for Attorney General idea now thinks he won't get confirmed. In his private conversations over the past few days, President-elect Donald J. Trump has admitted that his besieged choice for Attorney General, Matt Gaetz, has less than even odds of being confirmed by the Senate. So, on the same day that failed lobbyist Elon Musk goes all out in his public lobbying of the United States Senate for Matt Gaetz, Donald Trump allows it to be leaked to the New York Times that Donald Trump doesn't think Gaetz is going to get confirmed. Which one of them do you think is right?